Hello there, how are you tonight? There are some parts of everyday life that we rarely stop to think about, simple things, quiet routines, moments that pass almost unnoticed, but every now and then, it's interesting to pause and wonder how those same moments might have felt in a very different time. Imagine, for a moment, needing to step away, not into a modern, private space, but into something far less familiar, something more open, more basic, and perhaps a little less comfortable than you might expect. At first, it may not seem like a big difference, just another part of daily life, but as you begin to look closer, small details start to stand out: the setting, the tools, the lack of privacy, and the quiet understanding that this was simply how things were done. Before we continue, take a moment to like the video. Subscribe if you enjoy these calm journeys, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. It's always a little comforting seeing how far these stories travel. Now, let's gently step into the medieval world and explore what it was really like to handle one of life's most ordinary, yet rarely discussed routines. The day begins quietly. A pale grey light stretches across the horizon, slipping through narrow windows, brushing against stone walls that have held centuries of silent mornings. Somewhere in the distance, a rooster calls, not sharply, but softly, as though even it understands the slow rhythm of this world. Inside, people begin to wake, not all at once, not hurried, just a gradual stirring. Blankets shifting, wooden floors creaking, the quiet exhale of breath in cold air. And among the many small needs that accompany waking, there is one that cannot be ignored for long: a simple daily need. It exists without ceremony, without discussion, and yet it shapes movement, decisions, even architecture itself. In the medieval world, there is no clear boundary between comfort and necessity. Life is not designed around ease. It is built around function, survival, and adaptation. So when the body calls, there is no polished tile, no quiet lock on a door, no guarantee of solitude. Instead, there is awareness, an awareness of space, of people nearby, of where one must go. For some, it means stepping outside into the early chill. Bare feet or worn shoes meeting damp earth, grass still holding onto the night's moisture. The air is fresh, but sharp, carrying scents of soil, animals, and distant smoke. There is a stillness to it, a kind of quiet acceptance. For others, especially those within larger buildings, the journey is different. Not outside, but through dim corridors where light barely reaches and footsteps echo softly against stone. No signs, no labels, just familiarity. You either know or you learn. Unlearning in this world is often silent. There is no instruction given aloud, no formal explanation. Instead, it is observed, understood, passed along without words, because this, like so many things, is simply part of life. There is no embarrassment in the same way we might think of it today. No sharp sense of awkwardness. Only a quiet practicality. Still, that does not mean comfort. Far from it. There are moments, brief, almost unspoken, where discomfort settles in. A hesitation, a glance around, a small awareness of exposure, of vulnerability. But even that fades quickly, because the day continues. Tasks await. Fires need tending. Animals need feeding. Bread must be baked, tools repaired, water carried, and so this simple need becomes just another thread woven into the fabric of daily life. Unremarkable, yet essential. As the sun rises higher, the world becomes busier. Voices grow louder. Movement increases. And the quiet solitude of early morning begins to dissolve, which means fewer moments of privacy, fewer chances to slip away unnoticed, and so, timing matters, subtle choices are made. When to go? Where to go? How to avoid others? Or perhaps, how not to care at all, because in a world where space is shared and life is lived closely, the idea of complete privacy is fragile, almost unfamiliar, yet somehow people adapt, they always do, and as we continue, as we move deeper into this world, we'll begin to see how this simple daily need connects to something larger, to space, to design, to social structure, and to the quiet, unspoken rules that shape everyday life. For now, just sit with the stillness of this morning, the cool air, the soft light, the slow rhythm of a world waking up, and the quiet understanding that even the simplest needs carry stories waiting to be noticed. The morning has now fully arrived, light settles across the land, gently revealing what the darkness had softened. Shapes become clearer, paths more defined, and the quiet solitude of early dawn slowly begins to fade with it. Something else fades too, privacy. In the medieval world, privacy is not a given. It is not built into walls or secured behind doors. Instead, it exists in fragments, brief moments, small opportunities that come and go without promise. Most people live close together, very close. Families share single rooms. Workers sleep beside tools. Travelers rest in common spaces where strangers breathe the same air, separated only by thin fabric or simple distance. There are no silent, isolated corners waiting to be claimed, only spaces that are borrowed briefly and often shared, and so, something as simple as stepping away becomes something more delicate, more thoughtful. You begin to notice how people move, not quickly, not carelessly, but with quiet awareness, a glance here, a pause there, a subtle decision about when to leave and where to go, because in a world without clear boundaries, privacy becomes a kind of unspoken agreement. No one announces it, no one explains it, but somehow most understand. They look away at the right moment, they pretend not to notice, they give space. Even when space is scarce, still, this understanding is fragile. It depends on timing, on luck, on the rhythm of the day. Early morning offers the best chance. Before the village fully wakes, before footsteps fill the paths and voices carry through the air, there is a small window where solitude feels possible, but that window does not last long. As the sun rises higher, the world becomes more crowded. Children move freely, running between homes. Workers gather tools, preparing for long hours ahead. Conversations begin, soft at first, then gradually louder, and suddenly, the sense of being alone disappears for those inside larger buildings, castles, monasteries, or halls. The experience shifts, but does not necessarily improve. Stone walls may offer structure, but they do not guarantee privacy. Rooms are shared, corridors echo. Even the smallest sounds travel, and there is always someone nearby, servants moving quietly, guards standing watch, others passing through without warning. You are never completely unseen. Even when you hope to be, this creates a quiet tension, not overwhelming, not sharp, but always present, a gentle awareness that you exist within the view of others, that your movements, your routines, are part of a shared environment, and yet people adapt, They lower their gaze, they move at certain times, they develop habits that create the illusion of solitude. Even when true isolation is impossible, it becomes second nature, almost invisible. But if you pause, if you truly observe, you can feel it, that subtle layer of restraint, that quiet calculation behind simple actions, because privacy, in this world, is not a structure, it is a behavior, a shared understanding. Constantly negotiated without words, and sometimes it fails, a door left slightly open, footsteps arriving too soon, a moment interrupted, there is no confrontation. No loud reaction, just a brief stillness, a silent acknowledgement, and then life continues, because it must, there is no alternative. Over time, this shapes how people think, how they carry themselves. There is less expectation of complete separation, less desire for perfect isolation. Instead, there is acceptance, a quiet understanding that life is lived together, closely, continuously, and within that closeness, certain comforts are simply let go, not forgotten, just released. As the day moves forward, the need to find these small moments of privacy becomes more challenging, more uncertain, and yet it remains essential, because even in a world where space is shared, the human need for brief solitude does not disappear, it only becomes quieter, more subtle, almost hidden beneath the rhythm of daily life. And as we continue, as we step further into this world, we'll begin to see where people go when privacy cannot be found within walls, where necessity leads them, and how the environment itself becomes part of the solution. For now, just notice the shift from solitude to shared space, from silence to quiet movement, and the delicate balance in between, where privacy exists, not as a place, but as a fleeting moment, carefully held and easily lost. As the day unfolds, and the quiet balance of shared spaces becomes more apparent, a simple question begins to take shape. When privacy is limited, when walls do not fully separate, when rooms are rarely empty, where do people actually go? The answer is not a single place, it is many places, changing with surroundings, with status, with time of day. In the medieval world, necessity does not wait for comfort, it moves with the rhythm of life, adapting to whatever space is available. For those living in villages, the answer often lies just beyond the edge of home, a short walk, not far, just enough to create a sense of distance. Fields stretch outward, uneven and quiet, marked by paths formed through repetition rather than design. Tall grass sways gently, hiding small movements, offering a kind of natural cover. There are no walls here, and no doors to close, only the openness of the land, and the hope of not being seen. And yet, this openness carries its own feeling, a slight exposure, a quiet awareness of the horizon, of anyone who might pass in the distance, so people choose their spots carefully, near a hedge, behind a tree, along the curve of a small rise in the land, places that offer just enough concealment to feel almost private. Over time, these places become familiar, not marked, not spoken about, but understood, a shared knowledge, pass silently between those who live there. But the fields are not the only option. In towns, where space is tighter, the choices become narrower, buildings press closer together, streets grow busier, voices echo between wooden walls. Here, stepping away is not as simple. Some find quiet corners behind structures, narrow alleys where light barely reaches. Others move toward the edges of town, where activity fades and the land opens once again. But these journeys take time, and time is not always available. So people adapt in smaller ways. They move quickly, they choose moments carefully, they rely on the brief distractions of others, a cart passing, a group in conversation, a sudden shift in attention, small windows that allow for brief solitude inside larger structures. The experience shifts once more. Castles, monasteries, great halls, these places are built with purpose, but not always with comfort in mind. Within them, certain areas are designated for this need, not openly discussed, but clearly understood, often positioned along outer walls or in corners less traveled. These spaces are functional, simple, and in many ways more controlled than the open fields or crowded streets. But even here, the idea of privacy remains incomplete. Others may be nearby, footsteps may echo, the sense of being alone is never fully certain, and yet, for some, this is preferable, a defined place, a known destination, something consistent. In a world that often is not, still, not everyone has access to such spaces. Many rely on what is available in the moment, nature, distance, timing. These become the true solutions, not built structures, but adaptable ones. As the day moves forward, these patterns repeat quietly. People step away, return, continue their work, without pause or comment. It is not a disruption, not an event, just another movement within the flow of life, and over time, this creates a rhythm, a natural understanding of when spaces are likely to be free, when paths are less traveled, when the world briefly allows for solitude. It is subtle, almost invisible, but deeply ingrained, because in a world without fixed systems, consistency is created through behavior, through memory, through shared experience, and yet, there are moments when this balance is challenged, when the fields are too exposed, when the town is too crowded, when the timing is simply off. In those moments, discomfort lingers a little longer, decisions feel less certain, the need becomes more urgent, and the options feel smaller, but still, people manage. They always do, because necessity does not disappear, it only adjusts, and as we continue, we will begin to step into spaces that were designed, however simply, to meet this need more directly. Places built into walls, into structures, into the very design of daily life, places that bring us closer to understanding how this quiet routine became part of something larger. For now, just picture the movement, the quiet walk away from others, the stillness of a field, the narrow space between buildings, and the soft, unspoken awareness that even the simplest need shapes the way a world is built. As we move further into this world, the open fields begin to fade behind us, the quiet paths, the distant edges of villages, the subtle shelter of trees and hedges, all slowly give way to something heavier, something more permanent. Stone, thick walls rise upward, cool and unmoving, shaped by careful hands and long effort. Castles and large buildings stand not just as shelters, but as statements of power, of structure, of control. From the outside, they appear complete, solid, enclosed, protective, but inside, the story is more complicated. The moment you step through the entrance, the air changes, it becomes cooler, denser, touched by the faint scent of damp stone and lingering smoke. Light struggles to move freely here, slipping in through narrow windows or carried by flickering torches placed along the walls. Everything feels contained, and yet not entirely private. Within these large structures, life is layered. Rooms connect to corridors. Corridors open into shared spaces. Staircases wind upward and downward, linking different levels in ways that feel almost maze-like to those unfamiliar. But very few of these spaces are truly isolated. voices travel, footsteps echo, a door closing in one part of the building may be heard faintly in another, and so. Even here, privacy remains uncertain. People learn the rhythm of the structure, they understand which corridors are busiest, which staircases remain quiet, which corners are rarely visited. This knowledge becomes essential, because within these walls, the need for discretion does not disappear, it becomes more deliberate. In castles especially, life is divided by role. Servants move quietly through passages, often using separate routes designed to keep them out of sight. Nobles occupy larger rooms, but even these spaces are rarely empty. Guards remain nearby, attendants come and go. There is always a presence, always a sense that someone is not far away, and so, when a moment is needed, it is not simply taken, it is found. Carefully, some areas of the building are set aside for this purpose, not prominently marked, not openly discussed, but understood through use. Often positioned along the outer walls, these spaces are chosen with intention, not for comfort, but for practicality. The walls themselves become part of the solution. Openings are built outward, allowing what is unwanted to leave the structure. Carried away by gravity and distance, it is a quiet system, simple, effective in its own way, but not without its presence, a faint sound. Carried through stone, a subtle draft of air, small reminders that even within thick walls, nothing is entirely contained. Approaching these areas requires a certain awareness, a slowing of movement, a listening for nearby footsteps, a brief pause before stepping forward, because while the space exists, the privacy does not fully follow. Others may be waiting, others may pass. Timing, once again, becomes everything, and yet there is a strange sense of familiarity here. A routine built not from comfort, but from repetition. People come and go without acknowledgement, they avoid eye contact, they allow silence to do the work that words never would. It becomes an unspoken rule, a shared understanding that certain moments are simply left alone, still. The environment itself shapes the experience. Stone absorbs warmth, leaving the air cool even in daylight. Torches flicker softly, casting uneven shadows that shift with the slightest movement. There is no softness here, no attempt to make the space inviting, only function, only necessity, and over time, this leaves an impression, a subtle memory of discomfort. Not strong enough to disrupt life, but present enough to be felt. It lingers quietly in the background. As the day moves forward, these spaces see steady use, not crowded, but never entirely empty, a constant, quiet flow of movement, hidden within the larger activity of the building, and yet, despite their purpose, they are rarely thought about for long. People enter, leave, and return to their roles without pause, because in a place built on hierarchy and order, attention is given elsewhere, to duties, to responsibilities, to maintaining the structure itself, and so, this part of life remains in the background, essential, but unnoticed, until something shifts, a change in routine, a moment of inconvenience, a reminder that even the most carefully built systems have their limits. And as we continue, we will begin to look closer at one of these systems in particular, a feature both simple and surprisingly advanced for its time, something built into the very walls themselves, quietly shaping daily life in ways that often go unseen. For now, just listen to the echoes, the soft footsteps on stone, the distant murmur of voices, the quiet movement through narrow corridors, and the understanding that even within the strongest walls, privacy remains, something to be carefully found, and never fully held. As we continue deeper into the stone corridors, past the quiet footsteps and dim torchlight, we begin to notice something Subtle, a small opening, a narrow passage, a space that feels almost hidden. Yet intentionally placed, this is where the structure reveals one of its quiet solutions, the garderobe, at first glance. It may not seem remarkable, there is no decoration, no effort to make it inviting, only a simple design. Built into the thickness of the wall itself, a seat of stone or wood. Positioned above a vertical shaft, below. Darkness, an empty drop that disappears into shadow, leading outward beyond the walls. Where waste is carried away from the building, often into a ditch, a pit, or the flowing edge of a river below, it is a system defined by gravity, silent, unseen, and for its time. Surprisingly effective, approaching a garderobe is a quiet act. There are no signs to guide you. No markings to announce its purpose, only familiarity, a learned understanding of where these spaces exist. Often tucked into corners of towers, along outer walls, or at the far end of narrow corridors, the journey to reach one is rarely long. But it is deliberate, a turn here, a short passage there, a slight shift away from the main flow of movement, and then you arrive. The space itself is small, confined, just enough room to step inside and close a simple wooden door, if there is one at all. In some cases, there is only a curtain, or nothing. Privacy, once again, is partial, but within this space, there is at least a sense of separation, a boundary. However thin. Light enters sparingly, sometimes through a narrow slit in the wall. Sometimes only from the torch or candle carried in. The air is cooler here, carried upward from the shaft below, bringing with it faint reminders of what lies beneath, not overwhelming, but present, always present. Using the garderobe is not an experience of comfort, but it is one of structure, of predictability, unlike the open fields or uncertain corners of a town. This is a place designed for a specific purpose, and that alone changes the feeling. There is less searching, less uncertainty, only the quiet act itself, and the understanding that others have stood in this same space countless times before. There are small details that reveal how people adapted. Sometimes, a handful of straw is kept nearby, or bits of cloth. Reused and worn, simple materials. Chosen not for comfort, but for availability. Nothing is wasted, everything has a purpose, and even here, within this small enclosed space, that principle remains. The design of the garderobe reflects a larger way of thinking, practical, efficient, unconcerned with excess. It does not attempt to hide reality, it simply manages it, and yet there are limitations. The system depends on position, on maintenance. Though not in the way we might expect, over time, what is carried away does not always disappear completely. Below the walls, accumulation forms. Pits deepen, ditches fill, and occasionally, the presence of this system becomes more noticeable, a faint scent carried by the wind, a visible mark along the base of the stone, subtle reminders that even the most effective designs are not perfect. Still, within the walls, life continues without interruption. The garderobe becomes part of the routine, visited without thought. Left behind without reflection, it exists quietly in the background of daily life, and yet it tells us something important about how people understood their world, about how they worked with the limitations around them. Rather than trying to erase them, there is a kind of honesty in it, a directness, no illusion of perfection, only function, only necessity, and in that simplicity, there is a strange sense of order, a feeling that even the most basic needs have been given a place. As the day passes, these spaces remain in use, not constantly, but steadily, a rhythm that mirrors the movement of the people within the building, and as night approaches, their presence does not fade. If anything, it becomes more pronounced, because in darkness, with fewer distractions, the awareness of these spaces grows stronger, the quiet footsteps toward them, the soft creak of wood, the brief moments of solitude, held within stone walls, and then gone again. As we continue forward, we will begin to step outside these structured environments once more, to places where such systems do not exist, where people rely not on built design, but on shared spaces and communal solutions, places where privacy becomes even more fragile, and the experience shifts once again. For now, just picture the stillness of the stone, the narrow space, the faint light, the quiet drop into darkness below, and the understanding that within these walls, even the most hidden parts of life were carefully and quietly built into place. As we leave behind the thick stone walls and step once more into the open air, the world begins to feel different again, lighter, but not simpler. Villages and towns carry their own rhythm, the steady pulse of daily life, shaped not by towering structures, but by closeness. Here, everything exists side by side, homes built from wood and mud, pressed together along narrow paths, roofs uneven, walls worn by time, doors that open directly into shared space. There are no long corridors here, no hidden passages, only the constant presence of others, from early morning. The village is alive, smoke drifts slowly from low chimneys, animals stir in small enclosures, voices rise gently, blending into a soft, continuous hum, and within this closeness, every movement is seen, every step heard, which makes something as simple as stepping away more noticeable, more exposed. In these environments, there is no designated space built into the structure of life for private needs, no carefully placed openings in stone, no enclosed chambers set aside. Instead, people rely on what surrounds them, nature, distance, and timing. For those in smaller villages, the solution often remains similar to what we've seen before: a walk beyond the last row of homes, a quiet path leading outward, toward fields, trees, or open land. But unlike the early morning stillness, the village rarely stays quiet for long. People move constantly, children wander without pattern, neighbors pass each other with familiarity, work continues throughout the day, and so the act of leaving becomes something that must be done with awareness, not secrecy, but subtlety, a natural part of life, yet still something that draws quiet attention. Some choose the same paths each day, familiar routes that lead to places offering just enough cover. Others are just constantly changing direction based on who is nearby, where movement is lowest, where the land feels momentarily empty. In towns, the experience grows more complex, space tightens, buildings rise closer together, streets narrow, often uneven and crowded. Here, stepping away is not always about distance, but about finding absence, a moment where no one is looking, a brief pause in the flow of activity. Some turn toward alleyways, where light struggles to reach the ground. Others move toward the edges of town, where the structures thin out and the land opens again. But not everyone has the time for such movement. Work does not always allow it, and so shared solutions begin to appear, communal areas, simple, functional, and often used by many. These spaces are not hidden, they exist openly, as part of the environment, sometimes positioned near the edges of town, sometimes near areas where waste can be carried away more easily. They are not places of comfort, but they are understood, accepted, part of the structure of life. Using them requires a different kind of awareness, not just of space, but of others. Timing becomes more delicate. People wait, they observe, they choose moments when the space is less occupied. When the sense of exposure feels slightly reduced, there is no expectation of complete privacy, only a quiet respect, a shared understanding that this is necessary. And therefore, not to be disturbed. Even so, the experience carries a certain weight. A subtle discomfort, not always visible, but quietly felt, the closeness of others, the lack of separation, the awareness of being part of a shared routine, rather than an individual moment. And yet, over time, this too becomes normal, familiar, something no longer questioned, because in a world built on proximity, the idea of complete isolation begins to fade, replaced by something else: adaptation, acceptance, a quiet resilience. People learn to exist within these conditions without resistance. They move with the rhythm of their surroundings. They find small ways to create comfort, even when comfort is limited, and life continues, uninterrupted, as the day passes into afternoon, then slowly into evening. The village does not truly slow, it shifts, the light softens, shadows grow longer, voices lower, but do not disappear, and within this ongoing motion, the same patterns repeat. People step away, return, continue, without pause, without discussion, because this is simply how things are done. But beneath that simplicity, something deeper exists, a reflection of how closely life is shared, how little distance separates one person from another, and how even the most personal needs are shaped by that closeness. As we move forward, we will begin to look more closely at these shared spaces, at how they function, how they are used, and how people navigate them together. Places where individual moments become part of something communal, where privacy is not just limited, but redefined entirely. For now, just imagine the village, the narrow paths, the low homes, the quiet movement of people living side by side, and the understanding that in this world, even the simplest actions are never truly separate from the lives around them. As the village paths narrow, and the quiet edges of fields grow distant, we begin to step into spaces that are no longer chosen, but shared, not by a few, but by many. These are the public areas, places that exist not for comfort, but for necessity. In the medieval world, when space becomes limited, when time does not allow for distance, people turn to what is available together, and in doing so, something changes. The experience is no longer solitary, it becomes collective. These shared spaces are often placed at the edges of activity, not hidden completely, but not central either, a careful balance, close enough to be reached easily, far enough to avoid disrupting daily life. They might stand near the outskirts of a town, where the ground slopes gently away, or beside areas where water flows slowly, carrying things beyond sight. Sometimes they are simple wooden structures, roughly built, weathered by time. Other times, nothing more than designated ground, understood through use rather than marked by design. There is no decoration, no attempt to soften the space, only function, only purpose. Approaching such a place carries a different feeling, unlike the quiet walk into a field, or the enclosed stillness of a castle wall. Here, there is presence. Others are nearby, perhaps waiting, perhaps leaving, perhaps simply existing within the same moment. And yet, there is very little interaction, no conversation, no acknowledgement. People move with quiet intention, eyes lowered, steps measured, a natural rhythm that avoids drawing attention. It is not enforced, no one instructs it, but it is understood, a shared agreement that certain moments remain undisturbed. Even in shared space, still, the awareness of others does not disappear, it lingers, a soft tension beneath the calm, not uncomfortable enough to disrupt, but present enough to be felt. The structures themselves reflect this simplicity: wooden beams, roughly cut, openings aligned side by side, sometimes separated by thin partitions. Sometimes not at all, the materials are chosen for ease. Not for refinement, they age quickly, weather shapes them. Rain softens the wood, sun fades its color, time leaves its quiet mark on every surface, and yet they continue to serve their purpose day after day, without change, without improvement, because in this world, necessity outweighs comfort. Inside these spaces, time feels slightly slower, not because of stillness, but because of awareness. Every movement is quieter, more deliberate, even small sounds seem more noticeable, a shift of weight, a creak of wood, the soft movement of someone nearby. There is no complete separation, only partial distance, and yet people adapt. They create small boundaries through behavior, through silence, through the simple act of not looking. It is enough, not perfect, but enough. As the day continues, these spaces see a steady flow of use. Morning brings quiet visits, spaced out by the slow start of the day. Midday becomes busier. As activity across the town increases, evening brings a different tone, softer, more subdued. As the light fades and shadows stretch longer, and through it all, the same patterns repeat. People arrive, pause, leave, without disruption, without memory, because these moments are not meant to stand out, they are meant to pass, to blend into the background of daily life. But beneath that simplicity, something deeper exists, a reflection of how closely people live together, how even the most personal needs are shaped by community, by proximity, by the quiet acceptance that some parts of life cannot be entirely private, and yet, within that acceptance, there is also resilience, a calm ability to exist within shared space, without resistance, to move through moments of exposure. Without discomfort taking hold, it becomes natural, almost invisible, as the sun begins to lower, casting a softer light across the land. These spaces grow quieter once more. The steady flow slows, the presence of others fades, and for brief moments, something closer to solitude returns, not fully, but enough to be noticed, enough to feel, and in those moments, the space transforms, from communal to almost personal, a rare shift within a world that rarely offers it. As we continue, we will begin to look closer at the materials themselves, at the simple tools, the small objects that supported these routines, things often overlooked, yet essential, because even within shared spaces, even within limited comfort, people still found ways to adapt. For now, just imagine the quiet structure, the worn wood, the open air, the subtle presence of others, nearby but distant, and the understanding that in these places, life is not lived alone, but gently and quietly shared. As the shared spaces grow familiar, and the rhythm of daily life settles into something steady, our attention begins to shift away from places, and toward the small things within them, the objects, the materials, the simple tools that existed quietly in the background, yet played an essential role in this routine, in the medieval world. Nothing is wasted, everything is used with intention, not because of strict rules, but because resources are limited. And effort is valuable, so even the smallest items carry importance. At first, these materials might seem unremarkable, rough, basic, far removed from anything we might consider comfortable, but within their simplicity, there is a quiet practicality, a sense of adaptation. Shaped by what is available, straw is one of the most common, dry, lightweight, and easy to gather. It is used in many aspects of life: bedding, insulation, animal care, and here, too, it finds a place. Small bundles are kept nearby, sometimes loosely scattered, Sometimes stored in simple containers, its texture is coarse, not soft, but sufficient, and in a world without excess. Sufficient is enough. Cloth is another material. Though less easily spared, pieces of worn fabric, no longer suitable for clothing, are repurposed, cut into smaller strips, used carefully, washed when possible, reused when necessary. Nothing is discarded without purpose. Water, when available, becomes part of the process as well, but it is not always close, not always clean, and not always abundant, so its use is measured, a small amount, carried in a simple vessel, used sparingly. Every drop matters, in some places. Natural materials take the place of crafted ones. Leaves, broad and flexible, moss, soft and absorbent, earth itself, sometimes shaped or shifted to serve a purpose. These choices are not unusual. They are simply part of living closely with the environment, using what the land provides. Without question, the tools themselves are minimal. There are no complex designs, no polished surfaces. Only what is needed, and nothing more: a wooden container, a small bucket, a carved piece of stone, objects shaped by hand, worn smooth through repeated use. They are not personal, not owned in the way we might think today, often shared, used by many, returned to their place without thought, and because of this, there is little attachment. These items are not meant to last forever. They are meant to serve and then be replaced, quietly, without significance, and yet they tell a story of adaptation, of making do with what is available, of understanding that comfort is not always possible, but function can still be achieved. Using these materials becomes second nature. There is no hesitation, no comparison to something better, only familiarity, only routine. Hands move without thinking, actions repeat without effort, because this is what has always been known, and over time, even the roughness fades into the background. It becomes expected, unnoticed, part of the experience. But there are moments, small and fleeting, where awareness returns, a texture that feels particularly coarse, a material that is less effective than hoped, a reminder, however brief, of the limitations present, and then, just as quickly, it passes, because life does not pause for discomfort. It continues, always, as the day moves forward. These materials remain quietly in place, waiting, used, replaced, used again, a cycle without attention, without reflection. But as we look closer, as we truly consider these small details, something becomes clear. These tools, simple as they are, represent more than function. They reflect a way of life, a way of thinking, where necessity shapes every decision, where the environment is not separate, but deeply connected to daily routine, and where even the smallest object plays a role in maintaining balance. As evening begins to approach, and the light softens once more, these materials take on a different feeling. Shadows grow longer, edges blur, the roughness becomes less visible, and everything settles into a quieter presence, almost gentle, almost still. As we continue, we will begin to explore how these routines influence something deeper, not just action, but habit, cleanliness, perception, the quiet understanding of what it meant to be well kept in a world so different from our own. For now, just imagine the details: the dry straw, the worn cloth, the simple wooden forms, and the quiet hands that used them, without question, without hesitation, adapting, again and again, to the world around them. As the materials fade into the background, something more subtle begins to emerge. Not what people used, but how they behaved, how they adapted, how they maintained themselves, and what clean meant in a world so different from our own, in the medieval world. Cleanliness is not defined by perfection, it is defined by effort, by repetition, by what can realistically be done within the limits of time, water, and space. There is no fixed standard shared across all places. Instead, habits vary from village to town, from castle to field, from wealth to poverty. Cleanliness takes on different forms, but across all of them, there is a shared understanding: you care for what you can. When you can, water is central. But not always abundant, it must often be carried, drawn from wells, or collected from rivers. This makes it valuable, not wasted lightly, not used freely, so people learn to use it with intention, small amounts, carefully applied, hands washed when possible, faces cleaned in the morning, cloth dampened and reused when needed. It is not about abundance, but about maintenance, a quiet effort to stay within a sense of order. Soap exists in some form, though not always in the way we might imagine, made from animal fats and ash. It is simple, rough, but effective in its own way. Its presence is inconsistent, but appreciated when available. Still, much of cleanliness relies not on materials, but on habit, and habit becomes deeply ingrained. People develop routines that feel natural over time, morning rituals that require little thought, small acts performed before the day begins, not because they are strictly required, but because they bring a sense of readiness. In villages, these habits are often shaped by the environment itself. Dirt roads, open fields, constant contact with animals and soil. Cleanliness here is practical. Hands may be washed after work in the fields, not before. Dust is accepted as part of life. It settles and is removed when necessary, but never fully avoided. In towns and larger structures, habits shift slightly. More enclosed spaces create a different awareness: stone floors instead of earth, shared interiors instead of open air. Here, there is a greater sense of maintaining order within confined spaces. Sweeping becomes more regular, cloth is used to wipe surfaces, small efforts repeated throughout the day. In castles and larger buildings, cleanliness is often tied to service. Servants move through rooms quietly, maintaining spaces as part of their routine. Water is carried in containers, floors are cleared of dust or debris when possible. But even here, perfection is not expected, only upkeep, only continuity. And yet, despite these efforts, there is always a layer of imperfection, not visible in a dramatic way, but present in subtle forms. The limits of water, the roughness of materials, the constant movement of people through shared spaces, it all contributes to an environment that is never fully clean, but never fully neglected either. Some habits are shaped by necessity rather than choice: washing hands after certain tasks, changing cloth when it becomes too worn, keeping certain areas separate when possible. These actions are not formalized rules, they are learned behaviors, passed from person to person, observed rather than taught, and over time, they become instinctive, without thought, without hesitation. There is also a psychological aspect to cleanliness, a quiet connection between order and comfort. Even in simple spaces, a cleared surface, a swept floor, a washed hand, can bring a sense of calm, not perfection, but relief, a small moment where disorder is reduced. And that feeling matters, because life in this world is often physically demanding. Dust, smoke, weather, work, all contribute to constant exposure, so cleanliness becomes not just appearance, but relief from accumulation, from heaviness, from the slow layering of daily life. But it is never constant. There are always interruptions, always limits, and so people learn to accept cycles. Clean then not clean, then clean again, a rhythm that mirrors the rest of life as the day moves forward. These habits continue quietly in the background, unnoticed when things go smoothly, only visible when disrupted. A lack of water, a crowded space, a busy day that leaves no time for routine, and yet, even in those moments, the idea of cleanliness does not disappear, it simply waits to be returned to later as we continue forward. We will begin to see how these habits influence health, and how people understood the connection between body, environment, and well-being, a connection not fully understood in modern terms, but deeply felt in everyday experience. For now, just picture the small actions. As the habits of cleanliness settle into daily life, another presence quietly appears behind everything. Water. It is not always visible, not always nearby, and yet it shapes nearly every part of routine existence. In the medieval world, water is not something taken for granted, it is earned, carried, collected, or waited for. Its presence is uneven, shifting with landscape, season, and location. Some places are fortunate, rivers flow nearby, slow and steady, cutting through land that has been shaped around them for centuries. Wells are dug deep into the earth, reaching down into hidden reserves that feel almost uncertain until they're drawn up. Other places are less fortunate, where water must be carried from a distance, in heavy buckets, across uneven paths, under changing weather. This difference shapes everything, not just comfort, but habit, not just convenience, but structure. In villages, water often begins its journey at a well, a simple stone structure, circular, worn smooth by years of use. A rope lowers a wooden bucket into darkness, a pause, then the slow return upward, filled with water that reflects the sky for a brief moment before it disappears into containers. This act repeats countless times each day, not rushed, not ceremonial, just necessary. In towns, water becomes more shared, distributed through fountains or public wells, places where people gather briefly, not to stay, but to collect and move on. There is little conversation, only waiting, filling, leaving, a rhythm that belongs entirely to function. In castles and larger buildings, water enters differently. It is brought in, carried by servants through corridors, upstairs, into chambers. Large containers are used, heavy when full, requiring careful movement. Here, water is controlled, stored, allocated. It does not flow freely through the structure, it arrives, and is used with intention, because even within strong walls, supply is never limitless, and so water gains value beyond its physical presence. It becomes something to consider, to measure, to conserve. Its role in daily life is constant, but not always obvious. It appears in moments of washing, in cooking, in cleaning, in small acts of care that rarely draw attention on their own. But without it, none of those routines would exist in the same way. There is also a deeper relationship between water and environment. Rain is not just weather, it is resource. Storms are not only disruption, they are opportunity. People learn to observe the sky, to read its changes, to anticipate what it might bring. A sudden downpour can fill channels, refresh wells, soften dry ground, but it can also disrupt movement. Muddy paths, delay travel. So water is never neutral, it is always connected to circumstance. In colder seasons, its presence changes again. Rivers slow, surfaces freeze, access becomes more difficult, ice becomes both obstacle and tool, a reminder that even something essential can shift in form, and so adaptation continues. Containers are adjusted, routes are changed, timing is reconsidered, because water does not wait, and neither can those who depend on it. In all of this, there is a quiet awareness that water is both everywhere and nowhere at the same time, present in the body, in the land, in the air, and yet still requiring effort to obtain. This paradox shapes behavior in subtle ways. It encourages planning, it encourages restraint. It encourages a certain respect for what is available. Even small amounts are not dismissed, they are used carefully. Until nothing remains, and then more is sought. This cycle repeats endlessly, unnoticed in its regularity. But essential to survival, as the day continues, water moves through its many roles, from morning routines to midday tasks. From shared public use to private handling within homes, it flows. It is carried. It is stored. And it disappears into use, and yet it always returns, through wells, through rain, through the natural systems that quietly support life. As we move forward, we begin to see how water connects not just to daily tasks, but to the very idea of cleanliness and health. How its presence, or absence, shapes everything from comfort to survival, and how something so simple can become one of the most important elements of an entire world. For now, just imagine the movement, the lowering of a bucket, the reflection of sky in still water, the slow walk back through quiet paths, and the understanding that in this world, even something as simple as water is never truly simple at all. As water moves quietly through daily life, and routines continue without interruption, another layer begins to emerge, less visible, less defined, but always present: the air itself. In the medieval world, smell is not something separate from the environment, it is the environment. It lingers in spaces, settles into surfaces, moves with the wind, and quietly shapes how each place is experienced. At first, it may seem overwhelming to imagine, but within that world, it is simply normal, part of the background, something noticed, and then quickly accepted. Villages carry a mixture of scents: earth, damp and rich beneath constant use, smoke drifting from hearth fires that burn throughout the day. Animals close by, their presence woven into daily life. These smells do not stand apart, they blend softly, creating an atmosphere that is neither pleasant nor unpleasant, just familiar. In towns, the experience shifts, space tightens, movement increases, and with it, the air becomes heavier. Narrow streets hold onto what passes through them, moisture lingers, waste does not always move away quickly, and so certain areas carry stronger impressions. But even here, people adjust, they grow used to it. What might feel intense to an outsider becomes almost invisible over time. Inside buildings, the air changes again. Stone walls absorb and hold scent differently than open air. They trap it, soften it, blend it into something constant. In castles, the mixture is complex: cool stone, burning torches, faint traces of food, and subtle reminders of the systems built within the walls. Nothing stands out sharply, everything exists together, a quiet layering that remains consistent from one moment to the next. In smaller homes, the air feels warmer, more immediate. Cooking fires burn close to living space, smoke drifts upward, but never fully leaves. Cloth, wood, and straw all carry their own faint presence, and over time, these elements combine into something deeply familiar to those who live there, something that feels like home, even if it is not entirely comfortable. Shared spaces, especially those designed for necessity, carry their own atmosphere, less blended, more defined, but still not overwhelming in the way one might expect, because exposure is constant. There is no sudden change, no sharp contrast between clean and unclean, only gradual variation, and the human mind adapts quickly to such conditions. It learns to filter, to soften, to focus on what matters, and let the rest fade into the background. There are moments, However, when awareness returns, a shift in wind direction, a sudden stillness in the air, a change in weather that trap sent closer to the ground, in those moments, the presence becomes more noticeable, more defined, but even then, it does not disrupt life, it simply exists, as everything else does. Nature plays a role in this as well. Rain clears the air, briefly washing away what has settled. Cool winds carry scent across open land, dispersing it into distance. Sunlight warms surfaces, drawing out subtle traces that would otherwise remain hidden. Each element interacts with the others, creating a constant movement. Even when nothing appears to change, over time, people become deeply connected to these patterns, not consciously, but instinctively. They recognize places not just by sight, but by presence, by the way the air feels, the way it carries itself. This connection becomes part of navigation, of memory, of understanding where one is, without needing to look. And yet, despite this constant exposure, there is rarely complaint, not because conditions are ideal, but because they are expected. There is no alternative to compare against, no standard of perfect freshness, only the reality of the world as it exists, and within that reality, there is acceptance, a quiet resilience, the ability to live fully, even when conditions are imperfect. As evening approaches, the air changes once more, cooler, heavier, more still, scents settle closer to the ground, movement slows, and the entire environment takes on a softer, more muted presence, almost calm, almost quiet. In that stillness, everything blends again, becoming less distinct, less noticeable, part of a single, continuous atmosphere. As we move forward, we will begin to explore how these surroundings shift with the seasons, how temperature, weather, and time of year reshape everything we have seen so far, because in this world, nothing remains the same for long, not the land, not the routines, and not even the air itself, for now. Just imagine the space around you, the unseen layers, the quiet movement of scent through air, and the understanding that in the medieval world, what surrounds you is not just what you see, but everything you quietly breathe in. As the air settles, and the quiet presence of surroundings becomes familiar, another change begins to take shape, not sudden, not immediate, but steady and impossible to avoid. The turning of seasons. In the medieval world, time is not measured by clocks, but by the land itself, by light, by temperature, by the slow, undeniable movement from one season to the next. And with each shift, everything we've explored begins to change. In spring, the world softens, the ground, once firm from winter's hold, loosens beneath gentle rain. Paths become damp, sometimes uneven, holding the imprint of every step. Water becomes more available, streams swell, wells refill, the air carries a freshness that feels almost new. With this comes a subtle easing of routine. Movement outward becomes easier, fields offer more cover, more distance, more flexibility, but there is also uncertainty. Rain falls without warning, the ground shifts beneath weight, and so timing becomes less predictable. Moments that once felt certain now require adjustment. Still, there is a quiet sense of renewal, a feeling that the world is opening again. In summer, everything changes once more, heat settles across the land. Steady and unrelenting, the air grows heavier, thicker. Holding on to scent and stillness, water becomes more precious again, not absent, but more carefully used. Paths dry out, becoming firm beneath foot, but also more exposed. The openness of fields offers less concealment, the brightness of daylight extends longer, leaving fewer moments of shadow, and so, routines shift. Early morning and late evening become preferred times, moments when the sun is softer, when the world feels less watchful. during midday. Activity slows, not by choice, but by necessity. The heat demands it. In towns and enclosed spaces, summer brings a different challenge. Air does not move easily, narrow streets hold warmth, stone walls absorb and release heat slowly, creating spaces that feel still, almost unmoving, and within that stillness, everything becomes more noticeable. Every sound, every movement, every presence. Autumn arrives quietly, almost unnoticed at first. The air cools. Just slightly, the light softens. Losing its sharp edge, leaves begin to fall, covering the ground in uneven layers. With this comes a sense of transition, not as unpredictable as spring, not as intense as summer, but steady, reliable. The land becomes quieter, movement slows naturally. There is less urgency, less pressure from the environment itself, and within this calm, routines feel more stable, more consistent, paths are clear, air is balanced, moments of solitude feel easier to find. Not because of space, but because of rhythm. Winter, however, changes everything. Cold settles deep into the land, not just on the surface, but within it. The ground hardens, water slows, sometimes freezing entirely. Access becomes limited, movement becomes deliberate, every step requires effort, every action more considered. Stepping outside is no longer simple. The air bites, wind cuts across open spaces, and what was once a short walk becomes something longer, more demanding. Within buildings, the experience shifts again. Fires burn constantly, providing warmth but also filling spaces with heavier air. Windows remain closed, ventilation is reduced, and so everything becomes more enclosed, more contained. In these conditions, routines adapt once more. Distance is minimized, timing becomes essential, moments are chosen carefully, not just for privacy, but for comfort, because in the cold, even small discomforts feel larger. And yet, despite all of these changes, life continues. Always, people adjust, they observe, they respond to the environment without resistance, without expectation that it should be different. This is simply how the world moves, and within that movement, routines evolve naturally, not forced, not planned, just shaped by what surrounds them. As the seasons turn again and again, these patterns become familiar, expected, almost invisible in their repetition. But each season leaves its mark on the land, on the structures, on the people themselves, and slowly, these marks begin to reveal something deeper, a connection between environment and experience, between nature and daily life. As we continue forward, we will begin to see how these differences extend beyond the seasons into something more personal, more human, the role of social class, and how it shapes access, comfort, and experience in ways that are not immediately visible. For now, just imagine the change: the soft rain of spring, the heavy warmth of summer, the quiet balance of autumn, the deep stillness of winter, and the understanding that in the medieval world, every season reshapes even the simplest parts of life. As the seasons turn, and the rhythm of life continues without pause, a quieter difference begins to reveal itself, not in the land, not in the air, but in people. In the medieval world, life is not experienced the same way by everyone. The routines may appear similar from a distance, but up close, they shift, subtly at first, then more clearly. Social class shapes access, it shapes space, and in many ways, it shapes comfort for those living in castles or larger estates. The structure itself offers a kind of advantage, not complete privacy, but more control, more predictability. Spaces are built with intention, garderobes placed along outer walls, corridors that allow movement away from central activity. Rooms that, while not entirely private, provide a degree of separation. There is still awareness of others, still the quiet presence of shared life, but there are also moments, small ones, where distance can be created, where time can be chosen more freely, and that difference matters. Water, too, is more accessible here, not abundant, but more available, carried regularly, stored in larger quantities, used with slightly less restraint. Cleanliness, in this setting, becomes more consistent, not perfect, but more maintained. Cloth is replaced more often, spaces are tended more regularly, and while the experience is still shaped by the same limitations, those limitations feel less immediate, less pressing for those in villages. The experience is different, more exposed, more dependent on environment. There are no built systems to rely on, no designated spaces within walls, only the land. And what it offers, privacy, becomes something that must be found, not provided. Timing becomes more important, distance becomes necessary, and while these solutions are effective in their own way, they require more effort, more awareness, more adaptation. In towns, the contrast becomes sharper. People live closer together, space is limited, and shared areas become more common. Here, social class influences not just access, but experience within the same space. Those with slightly more means may live nearer the edges, where movement outward is easier, where the environment offers more flexibility. Those with less remain closer to the center, surrounded by constant activity, with fewer opportunities for solitude. But even within these differences, there is a shared understanding, a quiet acceptance of one's position, not always questioned, not always resisted, because this is the structure of the world as it exists, and within that structure, people adapt. They develop habits that align with what is available to them. They find comfort where they can. They adjust expectations, not out of resignation, but out of necessity. Still, there are moments when the difference becomes more noticeable, a passing glance into a space that feels more ordered, more contained, a brief awareness of what it might be like to have more control, more distance. But these moments are fleeting. They do not linger, because life continues, work remains, and attention returns to the immediate. Within larger buildings, even among those of higher status, there are layers. Not all experience the same level of comfort. Servants, though inside the structure, move through different spaces, use different routes, access different areas. Their routines are shaped by duty, by movement, by the need to remain unseen when necessary, and so their experience often mirrors that of those outside the walls. Despite being within them, this layering creates a complex picture, not a simple divide, but a spectrum, a range of experiences, all connected by the same basic need, yet shaped differently by circumstance. And yet, across all of it, one thing remains consistent: adaptation. Whether in stone corridors or open fields, in shared spaces or private chambers, people adjust. They find ways to exist within their conditions, to move through daily life without disruption, to maintain routine, even when comfort varies, because in the end, necessity does not change, only the way it is met. As the day fades once more into evening, and the differences between spaces soften in the dim light, these contrasts become less visible, less defined. For a moment, everything feels closer, more equal, but the structure remains, always present. Even when unseen. As we continue, we will begin to explore how these systems, these routines, and these environments present challenges, not always obvious, but always there, small difficulties, repeated over time, shaping experience in ways that are easy to overlook. for now. Just imagine the contrast: the thick walls of a castle, the open edge of a field, the narrow street of a crowded town, and the understanding that in this world, the same simple need is lived differently by every person. As differences in space and status settle into the background, another pattern begins to emerge, less visible, but deeply felt: time, not as numbers on a clock, but as a rhythm, a flow that shapes when things happen, and how they are experienced. In the medieval world, daily life is guided by light, by the rising and setting of the sun, by the subtle cues of the environment, and within that rhythm, routines take form. They are not written down, not scheduled in precise moments, but they exist clearly. Through repetition, morning is the beginning, not sudden, but gradual. Light enters slowly, spreading across rooms, fields, and paths. With it, people begin to move. Quietly at first, stretching, waking, preparing for the day ahead. This is often the most favorable time. The air is cooler, the world is less active, fewer people are moving about, and because of this, it offers something rare: a brief sense of privacy, moments where stepping away feels easier, less observed, less constrained. So many choose this time naturally, not by instruction, but by experience. Over time, it becomes habit, an unspoken understanding that early morning offers the best conditions. As the day progresses, everything changes. The village fills with movement, the town grows louder, corridors become more active, work begins in full, and with that, opportunities become fewer, not impossible, but less certain. Now, timing requires more awareness, more attention to the flow of others. People begin to notice patterns: when certain areas are quiet, when paths are less traveled, when shared spaces are temporarily empty. These observations become part of routine, small adjustments made throughout the day, a pause here, a delay there, a decision to wait just a little longer, because in a world without fixed privacy, timing becomes the closest thing to control. Midday brings its own challenges. The sun is highest, light is strongest, movement is constant, and in warmer seasons, heat settles heavily across the land. This is not an ideal time, not for comfort, and not for subtlety, and so many avoid it, if possible, choosing instead to wait for a quieter moment. But not everyone has that choice. Work does not always allow flexibility, and so, for some, midday becomes necessary, a time of acceptance rather than preference. Evening shifts the rhythm once more, light begins to fade, shadows grow longer, activity slows. Though it does not stop entirely, there is a softening of movement, a quiet transition, and within this transition, new opportunities appear. Fewer people are outside, shared spaces become less occupied, the world feels less watchful. For many, this becomes another preferred time, not as quiet as early morning, but still offering a sense of ease, a chance to move with slightly more freedom. Night, however, is different. Darkness changes everything, visibility drops, movement becomes cautious. Paths are harder to navigate, and within enclosed spaces, light must be carried: torches, candles, small sources that flicker, revealing only what is close. In this environment, routines continue, but with greater care. Steps are slower, awareness increases, because the absence of light creates uncertainty. And yet, for some, night offers something else: a deeper sense of solitude, a feeling of being unseen, not because others are far away, but because darkness creates distance, a soft barrier between people. Still, it is not without risk, and so, it is used carefully. Throughout all of this, one thing becomes clear: there is no single right time, only preferred moments, shaped by experience, by environment, by necessity. People learn what works, they adjust, they create personal rhythms within the larger flow of the day, and over time, these rhythms become instinctive, almost automatic, no thought required, just action, as the days repeat again and again. This sense of timing becomes part of identity, part of how each person moves through the world, not just in this routine, but in all aspects of life, because time, in this world, is not controlled, it is followed, respected, adapted to, and within that adaptation, there is a quiet harmony, a sense that even without structure, life still finds its balance. As we continue forward, we will begin to explore the challenges that exist within this balance, the small difficulties, the subtle limitations that shape experience in ways that are not always visible. For now, just imagine the rhythm, the quiet morning, the busy midday, the soft evening, the uncertain night, and the understanding that in the medieval world, when something is done, matters just as much as how it is done. As the rhythm of daily life becomes familiar, and the patterns of time settle into place, a quieter truth begins to surface, not immediately obvious, not often spoken, but always present. The system, while functional, is not without its challenges. At first, these challenges seem small, easy to overlook, a slight inconvenience, a moment of discomfort, but repeated day after day, they begin to shape the experience in deeper ways. Distance is one of the first. In villages, stepping away often means walking beyond the safety of home, not far, but far enough to matter, through uneven ground, across paths that shift with weather, into spaces that are never fully certain. In good conditions, this is manageable, even quiet, but when the land changes, so does the journey. Rain turns paths to mud, winter hardens the ground, making each step more difficult. Darkness reduces visibility, forcing slower movement, and what was once simple becomes effort. In towns, distance is replaced by crowding. The challenge is not how far, but how close. Spaces are shared, movement is constant, and finding a moment without interruption becomes uncertain. There is always the possibility of being seen, of being approached, of having a moment broken before it is complete. This creates a quiet tension, not overwhelming, but persistent, a subtle awareness that never fully fades. In larger structures, the system offers more definition, but introduces different limits. Garderobes rely on design, and design has boundaries. They are fixed in place, unchanging, and if one is occupied, there is little choice but to wait or to move elsewhere, through corridors that may or may not offer privacy. Maintenance, though not always visible, also plays a role. Over time, accumulation builds below walls, beneath structures, in areas rarely seen but always present when conditions are right. This remains unnoticed, but when something shifts, when air becomes still, or weather changes, the system reveals its imperfections. Subtle, but undeniable. There is also the challenge of timing, as we've seen. The day offers moments that are more suitable than others, but life does not always align with ideal moments. Work continues, tasks demand attention, and sometimes the need arises when conditions are least favorable. Midday heat, evening crowds, cold nights, moments when comfort is limited. But necessity remains. In those times, there is no delay, only adaptation. Materials, too, present their own limitations. Straw wears down quickly, cloth becomes less effective with repeated use, natural elements vary in availability, nothing is perfectly reliable. And so, people are just constantly replacing, reusing, making do, always finding a way. Even when the solution is not ideal, weather adds another layer. Wind can expose what is meant to remain private. rain can disrupt access, making certain areas difficult to reach. Cold can make even short moments feel longer, more uncomfortable, and heat can intensify every other challenge, making the environment feel heavier, more present, even within shared spaces. Where structure exists, there are difficulties, limited separation, minimal protection from sound or awareness, a constant sense of presence, even when no one is directly engaged. And yet, despite all of this, the system continues, not because it is perfect, but because it works well enough. That phrase, well enough, defines much of life in this world. There is no expectation of ideal conditions, only the expectation that things will function, that needs will be met, even if not comfortably. Over time, people stop noticing the challenges in the same way, not because they disappear, but because they become part of the background, accepted, expected, integrated into routine. Still, there are moments when awareness returns, a particularly difficult day, a situation where multiple challenges overlap, distance, timing, weather, all at once. In those moments, the system feels more fragile, more limited, and yet, even then, it does not fail completely, because adaptation fills the gaps. It always does. People adjust, they find alternative paths, they wait when they must, they move when they can, and life continues, uninterrupted, as we move forward. We begin to see how these challenges connect to something deeper. To health, to the body's response to environment, to the long-term effects of living within such conditions, a connection not always understood, but always present, for now. Just imagine the small difficulties, the uneven path, the crowded space, the moment that does not come at the right time, and the quiet resilience required to move through it all again and again, without pause. As the challenges of daily life settle into the background, and the system reveals both its strengths and its limits, a more delicate question begins to form, not always asked directly, but always present beneath the surface. What does this mean for health? In the medieval world, the connection between environment and well-being is understood, but not in the way we know today. There are no clear explanations, no precise knowledge of unseen causes, only observation, experience, and the quiet awareness that certain conditions lead to certain outcomes. Cleanliness, as we've seen, is maintained through habit, through effort, through repetition, but even with that effort, the environment remains imperfect. Water is not always pure, it is drawn from wells, rivers, sources that may be shared with animals, with waste. With the natural flow of the land, it appears clear, but clarity does not always mean safety, and yet it is used, because it must be, because there is no alternative. This creates a subtle risk, one that is not fully understood, but often felt. Illness comes, sometimes without warning, sometimes spreading quietly through households, through communities. People notice patterns, they begin to associate certain conditions with discomfort, with sickness, with decline, but the reasons remain unclear, so responses are shaped not by science, but by belief, by tradition, by what seems to work. Air, for example, is often thought to carry influence. Heavy air, stagnant air, is seen as something to avoid. Fresh air, open space, is preferred when possible. This belief is not entirely misplaced, though not understood in detail. It reflects a real observation, that environment matters, that surroundings affect the body. Even if the mechanism is unseen, hygiene practices develop within this framework. Washing hands when water is available, keeping living spaces as orderly as possible, avoiding obvious sources of decay or waste, these actions are not always consistent. But they exist, guided by experience rather than instruction, in shared spaces, where many people rely on the same environment. The challenge increases. Close proximity allows things to spread more easily, not just scent or sound, but illness, and yet life continues within that closeness. Because separation is not always possible, so people adapt again, they rest when needed, they use simple remedies. Herbs, warm liquids, rest and time. There is a quiet reliance on the body's ability to recover, and often it does, but not always, within larger structures. Conditions vary, access to slightly cleaner water, more controlled environments can make a difference, but not enough to remove risk entirely, because the system itself, while functional, does not eliminate exposure, it only manages it. There is also an understanding, subtle but present, that routine matters, that maintaining certain habits, even imperfectly, leads to better outcomes than neglect. And so, people continue their efforts, not with certainty, but with hope, with a belief that these small actions make a difference over time. This creates a culture of quiet care, not perfect hygiene, but consistent attention, a willingness to respond, to adjust, to do what can be done within limits, and within that, there is resilience. The body adapts. Just as the environment does, it learns to exist within these conditions, to recover, to endure, to continue, as the day fades into evening, and the physical demands of life settle into rest. The connection between body and environment becomes more noticeable, fatigue, relief, the quiet awareness of how the day has been experienced, and within that awareness, a deeper understanding begins to form, that health is not separate from daily life, it is part of it, shaped by every action, every condition, every small detail that goes unnoticed in the moment. As we continue forward, we will begin to see how people adapted not just physically, but mentally, how they adjusted their expectations, their behaviors, their sense of normal, creating a life that feels balanced, even within limitation. For now, just imagine the quiet connection, the water that is used, the air that is breathed, the spaces that are shared, and the understanding that in the medieval world, health is not controlled, but gently and constantly negotiated. As the connection between environment and health becomes clearer, and the limits of the system settle into quiet understanding, something else begins to emerge, not a tool, not a structure, but a response, adaptation. In the medieval world, adaptation is not a choice made once, it is a constant process, a quiet, ongoing adjustment to whatever conditions are present. People do not wait for the world to change, they change with it. At first, this may seem subtle, small shifts in behavior, slight adjustments in timing, but over time, these small changes build into something much larger, a way of living that feels natural. Even when conditions are not ideal, in villages, adaptation begins with the land. People learn its patterns, where the ground is firm, and where it softens after rain, where privacy can be found, and where it cannot. These details are not written down, they are remembered, passed through experience, and slowly they become instinct. Movement becomes guided by familiarity. Paths are chosen not just for distance, but for comfort, for timing, for discretion. In towns, adaptation takes a different form. Here, the challenge is not the land, but the presence of others. So people learn to read movement, to sense when spaces are occupied, and when they are briefly empty. They adjust their pace, they wait, they move at moments that offer the least interruption. It becomes a quiet form of awareness, a sensitivity to the flow of life around them, within larger structures. Adaptation is shaped by routine. Corridors, rooms, and shared spaces each carry their own patterns, times when they are active and times when they are still. Those who move within these spaces learn quickly. They recognize these rhythms. They use them, not to avoid the system, but to move through it more smoothly. Even materials, imperfect as they are, become easier to use with time. Hands learn how to handle them, how to make them more effective, less uncomfortable. Experience replaces difficulty, and what once felt awkward becomes familiar. There is also an emotional adaptation, perhaps less visible, but just as important. Expectations shift. What might seem inconvenient at first becomes normal. What might feel uncomfortable becomes acceptable, not because conditions improve, but because perception changes. This is not resignation, it is adjustment, a way of aligning the mind with the reality of the world, and within that alignment, there is a kind of ease, not complete comfort, but a steady acceptance. Over time, this adaptation creates resilience, a quiet strength, the ability to continue without constant frustration, without resistance to every small difficulty. Instead, there is flow, a movement through life that feels steady, even when conditions vary. This does not mean challenges disappear. They remain, always present in some form, but they are no longer obstacles. They are simply part of the experience, something to move through, rather than against, as the day unfolds. These adaptations guide every action, without thought, without effort. People move when the moment feels right. They adjust when something changes. They respond to the environment almost instinctively, and in doing so, they maintain balance, not perfect balance, but enough to keep life moving, enough to create a sense of stability within uncertainty. As evening approaches and the world softens once more, this adaptation becomes even more visible. Movement slow, choices become more deliberate, the rhythm of the day settles into something quiet, almost effortless, and within that quiet, there is a sense of understanding that life, in this world, is not about control. It is about response, about listening to the environment and adjusting accordingly. As we continue, we will begin to see how this adaptation leads to something even more subtle, a quiet normalcy, a sense that all of these routines, all of these conditions, are simply part of life, unremarkable, unquestioned, for now. Just imagine the adjustment, the small changes in movement, the quiet shifts in timing, the acceptance of what is, and the understanding that in the medieval world, people did not wait for things to become easier. They simply learned to move with them. As adaptation settles into daily life, and the need to adjust becomes second nature, something subtle begins to take shape, a quiet normalcy, not something announced, not something consciously created, but something that forms over time, gently, almost unnoticed. What was once uncertain becomes expected. What once required thought becomes instinct, and the routines we followed so closely begin to feel ordinary. In the medieval world, this sense of normalcy is not built on comfort, it is built on familiarity, on repetition, on the simple fact that something happens again and again, until it no longer stands out. Morning arrives, light spreads slowly across the land, and without hesitation, people begin their day. There is no pause to question the routine, no reflection on its difficulty, only movement, steady, quiet, practiced. Each step follows the last, not because it must, but because it always has. The same paths are walked, the same spaces are used, the same materials are handled. Without thought, and over time. Even the smallest details lose their sharpness, they fade into the background. The roughness of surfaces, the limitations of space, the presence of others, all of it becomes part of a single, continuous experience, something that is felt, but not examined, in shared spaces. This normalcy is especially clear. People move around one another with ease, without instruction, without hesitation. There is an understanding that does not need to be spoken, a quiet coordination, where each person knows when to move, when to wait, when to leave, and because of this, what could feel intrusive does not, it simply exists, accepted, unremarkable, in more private settings. The same pattern appears, not in the presence of others, but in the rhythm of solitude, the same small actions repeated each day, the same moments of pause, the same quiet transitions between activity and stillness. There is no urgency, no desire to change what is already known, because what is known feels stable, predictable, and in a world where so much is shaped by environment, that stability matters. Even discomfort loses its edge over time, not because it disappears, but because it becomes familiar. The body adjusts, the mind follows, and what once felt noticeable becomes part of the background, a constant, rather than a disruption. This does not mean life becomes effortless. Challenges remain, conditions shift, but within the routine, there is a kind of calm, a sense that everything is unfolding as it should. Not perfectly, but consistently, and consistency brings its own form of comfort as the day moves forward. These routines continue without interruption, unseen, unremarked, carrying people through each moment, without requiring attention. And as evening approaches, the same patterns return. Movement slows, spaces grow quieter, light fades, and once again, the routine completes its cycle, without ceremony, without reflection, only to begin again the next day. This repetition creates something deeper than habit. It creates belonging, a connection between person and place, between action and environment, a sense that this is where one fits, not because it is chosen, but because it is lived, and within that sense, there is peace, not the kind that comes from perfection, but the kind that comes from acceptance, from knowing what to expect, from moving through life without resistance. As we continue, we will begin to look at what all of this reveals, what these routines, these patterns, these quiet moments tell us about life itself, about what mattered, about what was valued, even when it was not spoken. For now, just imagine the repetition, the same morning light, the same quiet movement, the same familiar path, and the understanding that in the medieval world, what was once unusual became simply a part of life. As the routine settles into quiet normalcy, and each day flows into the next without resistance, a deeper understanding begins to emerge, not from any single moment, but from all of them together. Because when we step back and look at these small, often overlooked parts of life, they begin to reveal something much larger, something about how people lived, not just physically, but emotionally, mentally, quietly, in the medieval world. Life is not separated into neat categories. There is no clear boundary between comfort and discomfort, between private and shared, between effort and rest. Everything exists together, blended, interconnected, and within that connection, daily routines take on a different meaning. They are not interruptions, they are not inconveniences, they are simply part of the flow of life, handled without hesitation, without reflection, because there is no alternative to compare them to. This lack of comparison shapes perception in a powerful way. What might feel difficult, even uncomfortable, from a modern perspective, does not carry the same weight within that time, because expectation is different, and expectation defines experience. People do not seek perfect conditions, they seek stability, continuity, the ability to move through the day without disruption, and when that is achieved, even in simple ways, it is enough. This reveals something important, that comfort is not always about physical ease, it is about familiarity, about knowing what to expect, and being able to meet it, even if what is expected is imperfect. There is also a strong sense of acceptance, not passive, not resigned, but active, a willingness to engage with reality as it is, rather than as it could be. This acceptance allows life to move forward smoothly, without constant resistance, without the need to question every limitation, and within that, there is a kind of quiet strength, a resilience that does not come from overcoming obstacles, but from living alongside them, day after day, without disruption, without complaint. Community plays a role as well, even in moments that seem solitary. There is an underlying connection to others, shared spaces, shared systems, shared understanding. These create a sense of belonging. Even when privacy is limited, even when conditions are not ideal, because everyone exists within the same structure, facing the same realities, adapting in similar ways, and that shared experience creates a quiet bond, not always visible, but always present. There is also a sense of rhythm that defines life, not imposed, but discovered. A natural flow that emerges from the interaction between people and their environment. This rhythm provides stability, a pattern that can be followed, even when conditions change, and within that pattern, there is comfort, not because everything is easy, but because everything is known over time. This creates a perspective that is deeply grounded, a focus on what is immediate, what is necessary, what can be done right now. There is little space for abstraction, little need to imagine something entirely different, because life is lived in the present, in the small actions, in the quiet moments, and those moments are enough when we look at all of this together. The materials, the spaces, the routines, the adaptations, we begin to see that this simple, everyday necessity is not isolated. It is connected to everything, to environment, to community, to perception, to the way people understand their place in the world, and through that understanding, we begin to see the medieval world not as distant or unfamiliar, but as something quietly human. Different in form, but similar in essence, because at its core, life is still about meeting needs, adapting to conditions, finding balance within whatever circumstances exist. As we move into our final chapter, we will step back one last time, not to analyze, but to reflect, to sit with everything we've explored, and consider what it means. Not just for the past, but for how we see the present, for now. Just imagine the connection, the small routines that shape the day, the quiet acceptance that carries them forward, and the understanding that in the medieval world, even the simplest parts of life reveal something profound about what it means to live. As the rhythm of daily life settles into memory, and the details we followed begin to fade into a quiet whole, there is a natural pause, not an ending in the usual sense, but a moment to simply sit and consider what remains, because after everything we've seen, the spaces, the materials, the routines, the quiet adaptations, what lingers is not complexity, it is simplicity, a kind of simplicity that is easy to overlook, and yet deeply present in every part of life. In the medieval world, life is not shaped by convenience, it is shaped by necessity, by what is available, by what can be done in each moment, with what exists, and within that, there is a clarity, a focus on the immediate, the essential, the things that cannot be avoided, and therefore are simply accepted. There is no illusion of perfection, no expectation that every experience will be comfortable, or easy, or private. Instead, there is an understanding that life will move forward, not because conditions are ideal, but because they are sufficient, and that word, sufficient, carries a quiet weight. It does not promise comfort, but it allows continuity. It allows life to unfold, without interruption, without resistance. This way of living creates a different kind of awareness, a sensitivity to the present moment, to small actions, to the way environment and routine shape each other. Because when life is not surrounded by excess, even the simplest details become meaningful. A small amount of water, a familiar path, a quiet space. However brief, these are not taken for granted. They are noticed, felt, lived fully, even when they are imperfect. And within that, there is a kind of calm, not the calm of silence, but the calm of acceptance, of knowing that what is enough. This simplicity also reveals something about human nature, a quiet ability to adjust, to live within limitation, without losing balance, to find stability. Not in changing the world, but in moving with it, again and again. Through every season, every challenge, every small variation in daily life, this ability remains constant. It does not draw attention, it does not demand recognition, but it is always there, carrying life forward. Without pause, as we sit with this, there is a sense that the past is not as distant as it may seem. The structures are different. The tools have changed, the expectations have shifted, but the core experience remains familiar. The need to adapt, the search for balance, the quiet acceptance of what cannot be controlled, these are not limited to any one time. They exist across all of them, and perhaps that is what makes these moments worth exploring, not because they are unusual, but because they reflect something deeply human, something that continues. Even now, as the light begins to fade one last time, and the world settles into stillness, there is a final question that lingers, softly, almost unnoticed. If life can feel complete, even within such simplicity, what does that say about the way we experience it today? About the expectations we carry, the comforts we rely on, the things we believe are necessary, and if those expectations were to shift, even slightly, would our sense of comfort change with them? Would the ordinary begin to feel different? Would simplicity, once again, be enough? The answer is not immediate. It does not need to be. It simply remains there, quietly, waiting to be considered, and perhaps that is where this journey truly ends, not in the past, but in the space between what was and what is, a space where something very simple and very familiar can be seen in a new way. And as you drift a little closer to rest, that thought, soft and steady, may stay with you just a little longer.